The engine of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 roars to life, a familiar, guttural sound that vibrates through the entire cockpit, up through the seat and into the bones of the man strapped inside. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke runs through his pre-flight checks with the practiced ease of a veteran. The dials and gauges are old friends. The canopy is sealed, locking him into his own small world, a bubble of plexiglass and steel suspended thousands of feet above the earth. He's at Verden Airfield in central Germany. The date is October 14, 1943. The air is crisp and cold. Intelligence reports have been crackling over the wires all morning, warning of a major American bomber raid approaching, possibly the largest one yet. But Knoke has heard that before. He's a seasoned pilot, an ace. He has flown dozens of intercept missions against the daylight raids of the American 8th Air Force. He knows the drill. He knows what to expect. He pictures it in his mind. Formidable formations of 200, maybe 300 B-17 flying fortresses. They are heavily armed, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, but they are vulnerable. The key is to be aggressive, to strike fast and hard, to penetrate their defensive formations and break them apart. Once a bomber is isolated, it's a sitting duck. With a signal from the tower, Knoke pushes the throttle forward. The Bf-109 leaps down the runway, gathering speed until the earth falls away beneath him. He retracts the landing gear and banks, joining the other 11 fighters of his squadron. 12 Bf-109s, climbing together, a deadly pack of wolves ascending into the heavens to meet the shepherdless flock. Their task, intercept and destroy the incoming American raid. As they climb through the thin, cold air, ground control radios in with updates. The information is fragmented, staticky, but the message is clear. The American formation is massive. The numbers keep changing, and with each update, they grow larger. The first report comes in, estimating 300 bombers. Knoke nods to himself. A big raid, but manageable. His squadron has faced this before. Minutes later, another crackle over the radio. Revised estimate, 400 bombers. A murmur of surprise ripples through the squadron's radio channel. 400 is a significant force. This will be a tough fight. Knoke grips the stick a little tighter. Then another update. The voice from ground control sounds strained, almost incredulous. New estimate, 500, possibly more. 500? Knoke shakes his head. It has to be an exaggeration. Ground observers often get it wrong. They see multiple bomber streams separated by miles and mistakenly count them as one gigantic formation. It's an easy mistake to make. No, it can't be 500. That's an absurd number. He continues his climb, his eyes scanning the empty blue sky ahead. 20,000 feet, 22,000, 25,000 feet. He levels off, the air so thin his breath mists in front of his face, and then he sees it. And his blood runs cold. This is no exaggeration. This is no mistake by a panicked observer on the ground. The sky is filled with them, absolutely, impossibly filled. This isn't the usual concentrated formation of a few hundred aircraft that he's used to fighting. This is something else entirely, something new, something monstrous. Multiple, distinct bomber streams stretch from one end of the horizon to the other. He can see hundreds upon hundreds of B-17s locked in their tight, disciplined defensive boxes. These boxes are stacked at different altitudes, a terrifying three-dimensional fortress of aluminum and firepower covering miles and miles of airspace. The condensation trails streaming from their thousands of engines create a vast white grid across the sky, a celestial map charting a course directly to the heart of Germany. It looks like an entire city has taken flight. Knoke keys his radio, his voice betraying a hint of the shock that is coursing through him. How many do you count? The response comes back from one of his wingmen, his voice flat, devoid of its usual cocky swagger. I stopped counting at 300, and there are more behind them, many more. This wasn't a bombing mission. This was an invasion, an aerial armada that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe had ever encountered or even imagined. What Heinz Knoke and his fellow pilots were witnessing was the terrible, awesome culmination of America's industrial mobilization. It was the moment a theory of strategic bombing became a physical, sky-filling reality. The United States had spent the better part of 2 years, 1942 and 1943, in a Herculean effort. They built colossal factories that churned out bombers on an unimaginable scale. They established a vast network of training schools that turned farm boys and city kids into pilots, navigators, and gunners. They constructed a sprawling chain of air bases across England, transforming the British countryside into a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier. By October 1943, the American 8th Air Force was ready. They were ready to launch raids of a scale that would fundamentally change the nature of the air war. The specific mission that Knoke was intercepting, the second raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, officially involved 291 B-17 bombers. But that number was deceptively simple. When you factored in the diversionary raids, the support aircraft, and the swarms of escort fighters that were beginning to appear, the total number of American aircraft over Germany on that single day exceeded 1,000. For the German pilots in the air, the psychological impact was immediate and utterly devastating. Knoke and his comrades in the Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to a certain reality. They were the elite. They often held numerical superiority, and when they didn't, they were at least on par with the American formations they faced. Their confidence was built on a foundation of superior training, superior aircraft in many cases, and battle-honed tactics that had proven brutally effective. The German playbook was well established. They would attack in coordinated groups like a pack of wolves culling a herd. They would dive from above, head-on, guns blazing, trying to take out the lead bombers and disrupt the formation. They would pick off the stragglers, the damaged planes that fell behind. They pressed their attacks with a fierce aggression, forcing the bombers to break formation. Once the defensive formation was shattered, the bombers' interlocking fields of machine gun fire would fall apart, and the German fighters could pick them off one by one. These tactics worked beautifully when the Germans outnumbered or at least equaled the American defensive firepower. But against 1,000 American aircraft, the math simply fell apart. Numerical superiority was no longer just impossible, the very concept had become a bitter joke. On that October day, the entire Luftwaffe had approximately 800 single-engine fighters available to defend all of Germany, all of it. Even if they could have magically concentrated every single available fighter against this one raid, which was impossible, as other cities and targets still needed protection, they would still be outnumbered. And the most chilling thought of all, this was just the beginning. This was one raid on one day. Tomorrow there would be another, and the day after that, another. The production numbers coming out of America were not a secret. The German High Command knew. They were facing an enemy that could build planes faster than they could shoot them down. High above the German countryside, Heinz Knoke forces the strategic implications from his mind. He has a job to do. He banks his fighter, positioning himself for an attack run on one of the nearest bomber boxes. He picks his target, a B-17 on the edge of the formation. He follows the textbook, a head-on attack from 12 o'clock high. He pushes the nose of his Messerschmitt down, the aircraft gathering tremendous speed in the dive. The bomber formation swells in his gun sight, growing from a collection of tiny specks into a wall of massive four-engine behemoths. He aims for the cockpit of the lead bomber, his thumb hovering over the trigger. The closing speed is immense, over 600 miles per hour. He has only a few seconds to make this work. He squeezes the trigger. The 20mm cannons in his wings erupt, sending a stream of high-explosive shells tearing through the air. He sees his shots connect. Pieces of the bomber's nose cone shatter and fly away. The wing shudders under the impact, but the giant plane doesn't explode. It doesn't fall from the sky. It holds its formation, a wounded but still deadly giant. And behind it, 10, 20, 30 more bombers continue on, completely undisturbed. Knoke has to pull up sharply to avoid a collision, yanking back on the stick as a storm of .50 caliber slugs from the defensive gunners zips past his canopy. He climbs, his heart pounding, banking around for another pass. He glances back at the formation. He scored hits. He damaged one bomber. One out of the 30 or so in that single box. And as his eyes scanned the sky, he could see dozens more of these boxes, an endless river of them. The mathematics of the situation were as brutal and unforgiving as the flak-filled sky. Even if every single German fighter on this mission managed to shoot down one bomber, a wildly optimistic success rate, they would destroy maybe 100 to 150 bombers in total. For the Americans, this would represent a loss of 10 to 15% of their force. It would be painful, yes, but it would be sustainable. And the next day, in factories in places like Willow Run and Seattle, thousands of miles away, workers would be putting the finishing touches on brand new B-17s to replace those very losses. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was struggling to replace the fighters destroyed in that same battle. The sheer defensive firepower of this armada was something they had never faced before. Each B-17 carried at least 10 .50 caliber machine guns manned by trained gunners. A single defensive box of 30 B-17s could therefore bring 300 heavy machine guns to bear on any attacking fighter. 300! Approaching such concentrated firepower meant flying through a solid wall of lead. It was a suicidal proposition. German pilots who had previously attacked with near-reckless aggression now found themselves breaking off their attacks early, unwilling to press their luck against such impossible odds. Knoke makes 3 separate attack runs, expending all of his ammunition. He claims 2 bombers damaged, possibly destroyed, but he can't stay to confirm. His fuel gauge is dropping rapidly. Combat at high altitude burns fuel at an astonishing rate. He has no choice. He breaks off the engagement and turns for home, leaving the bomber stream to continue its inexorable journey eastward. By the time he can land, refuel, and rearm, the American bombers will have already dropped their payloads and be heading back to England. Back on the ground at Verdun, the mood among the returning pilots is grim. The usual post-mission banter is gone, replaced by a quiet, stunned disbelief. They gather in the briefing room, smoking cigarettes and trying to process what they have just seen. The consensus is universal. The Americans had launched over 1,000 aircraft in a single day. How could they possibly fight that? The Luftwaffe couldn't sustain such operations. German aircraft production, pilot training, and especially fuel supplies could not support daily missions of this magnitude. And yet, the Americans apparently could. And this was just one air force based in England. The Americans had other bomber forces in Italy and the Pacific, and they were still building up their strength. This wasn't their peak. This was their warm-up. The Second Schweinfurt Raid on October 14, 1943, would go down in the books as a tactical victory for the Luftwaffe. The Americans suffered horrific losses. 60 bombers were shot down, and another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped after returning to base. A total of 77 bombers lost out of 291. That's a 26% loss rate. By any traditional military calculation, such losses were completely unsustainable. The Luftwaffe celebrated the day. German propaganda hailed it as a great defensive victory, proclaiming that they had crushed the American raid and broken their strategic bombing capability. But behind closed doors, the German commanders who analyzed the strategic situation understood the terrifying truth. Yes, they had shot down 60 bombers, but the Americans had successfully put nearly 300 bombers over a critical target deep inside Germany, in broad daylight. And tomorrow, American factories would begin replacing every single one of those 60 lost planes. Within weeks, replacement aircraft and fresh crews would arrive in England. For the Americans, the losses would be made good. Meanwhile, Germany had lost approximately 40 fighters and, more importantly, their irreplaceable pilots in the effort to shoot down those bombers. Fighters that would take months to replace. Pilots who were, for all practical purposes, gone forever. Adolf Galland, the legendary ace and the inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, reviewed the reports from the October 14th raid. He saw past the triumphant headlines and recognized the chilling strategic implications. In his post-war memoir, he wrote a sentence that perfectly captured the sentiment of that day. "The day I saw reports of 1,000 American aircraft over Germany, I knew we had lost the air war." He continued, "We could shoot down bombers at rates that would make any other nations stop the campaign. But the Americans just kept coming. More bombers, more fighters, more crews. We were fighting an enemy with unlimited resources." What the Germans were facing was more than just industrial capacity. It was a fundamentally different philosophy of war. German military doctrine was built on the principle of Qualität, or quality. They emphasized superior aircraft, designed and built with meticulous engineering. They cultivated elite, highly skilled pilots, turning them into masters of aerial combat. Their tactics were refined, flexible, and ruthlessly effective. But the American doctrine emphasized Quantität, quantity and sustainability. American aircraft weren't always the single best performers in a one-on-one dogfight, but they were rugged, reliable, and most importantly, they were produced in absolutely vast, unbelievable numbers. American pilots weren't always as experienced as the long-serving German veterans, but the American training pipeline was a miracle of logistics, producing thousands upon thousands of capable replacements. American tactics didn't rely on individual heroics. They emphasized formation discipline, teamwork, and mutual support. The result was an American war machine that could absorb losses that would have crippled any other nation on Earth and simply continue fighting. Losing 60 bombers in a single day was a tragedy for the families of the crews, but for the American war effort, it was a manageable cost of doing business. Losing 40 experienced fighter pilots in a single day was, for Germany, a catastrophic blow. The brutal mathematics of attrition now overwhelmingly favored the side with the bigger factories and the deeper pool of manpower. By November 1943, the pattern was set. American raids of 300, 400, 500 bombers became routine. On some days, multiple raids would strike simultaneously, forcing the German defenses to split their forces. One bomber stream might hit an aircraft factory in the north, while another targeted railway yards in the south. The Luftwaffe fighters had to disperse, reducing their concentration and effectiveness against any single raid. And then, in early 1944, the situation went from dire to hopeless for Germany. The final nail in the coffin of the Luftwaffe arrived. It was called the P-51 Mustang. With the addition of external drop tanks, the Mustang had the range to escort the bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany, and all the way back. The bomber streams were no longer unshepherded flocks. They now had lethal guardians. German interceptors not only had to brave the overwhelming defensive fire of the bombers themselves, but they now also had to fight their way through swarms of some of the best fighter aircraft of the war. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological toll on the German pilots was immense and crippling. The diary entries of Heinz Knoke from late 1943 and early 1944 paint a grim picture of increasing despair. He described the utter helplessness of watching the massive bomber streams pass overhead, knowing he and his squadron were too few to stop them. He wrote about friends and comrades being killed in futile attempts to break through the American fighter screens just to get a shot at the bombers. He began to question whether continuing the fight served any purpose at all, when defeat seemed not just possible, but mathematically inevitable. German fighter pilot casualties skyrocketed. In 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 8,000 fighter pilots, killed, seriously wounded, or captured. This was more than the total number of fighter pilots Germany had at the start of that year. By all logic, these losses should have completely eliminated the German fighter arm. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The entire German training system was turned upside down. The pilot training program, which once took a leisurely 18 months to produce a skilled airman, was compressed to as little as 6 months. This frantic pace produced pilots who were barely competent. They lacked the hundreds of hours of practice needed to master their aircraft and survive in the unforgiving skies of combat. These rookie pilots were often sent into battle against experienced, well-trained American crews, and they died in droves, often on their very first or second mission.
This created a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. High casualties required more replacements, who then received even less training, which in turn led to even higher casualties. Fuel shortages made the problem even worse. By 1944, German pilot training programs had to slash their flight hours because every drop of aviation fuel was desperately needed for combat operations. New pilots were arriving at operational units with shockingly little time in the air, making them even more vulnerable. Meanwhile, in stark contrast, American pilot training programs were expanding. By 1944, the United States was training over 100,000 pilots per year, far more than they needed just to replace their combat losses. An American pilot arriving in a combat unit in England would typically have hundreds of flight hours under his belt. He would have practiced gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and combat tactics extensively, long before he ever saw an enemy fighter. The economic disparity behind it all was simply staggering. In 1944, American aircraft production exceeded 96,000 aircraft of all types. German production was approximately 40,000. American pilots often logged more hours in training than their German counterparts had in their entire careers.
American factories produced aluminum, aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that completely dwarfed Germany's entire industrial capacity. Heinz Knoke survived the war. He was one of the very few Luftwaffe fighter pilots who flew continuously from the early victories of 1941 to the final collapse in 1945 and lived to tell the tale. His memoir is a chronicle of the evolution of a mindset, from supreme confidence to utter despair. In 1941 and 1942, he and his fellow pilots believed they were invincible, that they were winning the war. In 1943, they recognized that the war was becoming difficult, but they still believed that victory was possible through skill and determination. But by 1944, most of them understood, deep down, that they were losing. They continued fighting out of a sense of duty, out of desperation, or simply because they could see no other alternative. The raid on October 14, 1943, the day German pilots first saw those truly massive, sky-filling American bomber formations, marked the psychological turning point. Before that day, they believed they could defend German airspace. After that day, they understood they were fighting an enemy that could replace its losses faster than Germany could possibly inflict them. The number, 1,000, became a symbol for the German pilots. Whether the exact count on any given day was 900 or 1,000 or 1,100 didn't really matter. What mattered was the scale. It was the sight of formations so vast they blotted out the sun, a tangible, terrifying representation of an industrial capacity beyond anything Germany could ever hope to match. American commanders knew exactly what they were doing. General Curtis LeMay, who planned and led many of these massive raids, later wrote, "We knew that putting 1,000 aircraft over Germany would demoralize their defenders, even if we took heavy losses. It demonstrated that we had unlimited resources. They could shoot down 100 bombers, and we'd send 200 tomorrow. Eventually, they'd run out of fighters, fuel, or pilots." The strategy worked. By the spring of 1944, German fighter resistance had been systematically broken. The veteran pilots were mostly dead or incapacitated. The new replacements lacked the skills to be effective. The chronic fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. The constant bombing had crippled German production facilities. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies of Europe from 1939 to 1941, was now just a shadow of its former self. The decline is clear in the Luftwaffe's own records. In early 1943, their fighter units were typically shooting down 5 to 10% of attacking bombers on a given raid, a respectable and potentially unsustainable loss rate for the Allies. By mid-1943, that had dropped to 3 to 5%. By early 1944, with the arrival of the Mustangs, it was often below 2%. It wasn't because the German pilots had stopped fighting, they were fighting with incredible bravery and desperation. It was because the American formations were so large, so well protected, and so numerous that even the most heroic defensive efforts were little more than a pinprick against an avalanche. Heinz Knoke's final diary entry about the bomber formations came in March 1945.
He described watching another massive American raid pass high overhead, flying with impunity through German airspace. He made no attempt to intercept. He couldn't. His unit had no fuel for combat operations. The bombers flew to their targets completely undisturbed, while the elite German fighters sat silent and useless on the ground. He wrote, "We've lost, not because we lack courage or skill, but because they have more of everything than we can possibly counter." The German pilots who first looked up on October 14, 1943, and saw 1,000 American bombers filling the sky understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't a temporary surge or a one-time maximum effort. This was the new reality. This was a sustainable, repeatable capability that would continue, day after day, week after week, until Germany was crushed. The industrial disparity that Admiral Yamamoto had so famously warned about when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was now destroying Germany from the air. Germany's war machine would continue to fight until the very end, but the outcome had already been determined, not on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. It was determined by the cold, hard logic of mathematics and industrial capacity. America could build, man, and operate 1,000 aircraft raids routinely. Germany could not stop them. The day the German pilots saw that reality painted across the sky above them was the day they knew the war for air superiority was lost, permanently. It was the day they stopped counting at 300.
It was the day they understood that individual courage and skill could not overcome an avalanche of industrial might. It was the day Germany lost the air war, even though the fighting and the dying would continue for another 18 long, brutal months.